Hello and welcome to an introductory course to APA Style. My name is Laura Malkevich and I'm a consultant at the Graduate Writing Center here at Teachers College. So today in this presentation, our goal is to help you understand what the purpose of using APA Style is, to familiarize you with some ways to cite articles both within your writing and in the reference list, to develop a toolbox of resources to use when trying to figure out how to apply APA style to your own writing, and understand the distinction between paraphrasing and plagiarism. So to start, let's talk about where you learn to write about APA style. So the APA manual began as an article published in Psychological Bulletin in 1929. That article reported results of a 1928 meeting of representatives from anthropological and psychological journals to discuss the form of journal manuscripts and to write instructions for their preparation. Since then, the APA Style Manual has evolved quite a bit. It's now in its 6th edition, which was published in 2009, and as it did originally, it described rules for the preparation of manuscripts. So it talks about how do you organize a manuscript? How do you write? What's the style of writing? What's the editorial style? What types of punctuation marks do you use? How do you format tables? How do you format images? How do you write a reference list? And also how to prepare a manuscript for publication. Since then, APA style has come to be used in many disciplines, from psychology to anthropology to social work and linguistics. It's also the unofficial style of Teachers College. So it's really important that you learn to write in APA style, because whether you're just taking classes at Teachers College now, or you end up to become a scholar or a writer in any of the fields listed here, you're most likely going to be used to write in APA. So now that we've talked a little bit about where APA comes from, the next question is, how do I learn to write in APA style? Where can I find information on how to write in APA style? Well, your first go-to should definitely be the APA Style Manual. That's going to give you a comprehensive overview of everything from how to write in APA style, to how to cite references in text, to how to format your reference list, and a bunch of other things. It's very comprehensive. We have a copy of it in the Graduate Writing Center, as well as copies in the library. I also highly recommend, if you're in grad school and plan to be writing in APA and a lot, to buy a style manual for yourself. You can also get a style guide, such as the Easy Writer, which gives more general information on how to write, or use online resources, which can be really helpful. The most commonly used one is the Online Writing Lab at Purdue, which has great examples of how to write and format text in APA style, as well as answer some major questions about how to reference different types of media using APA. Oftentimes I'll get questions from students where what they're being told by the Online Writing Lab at Purdue doesn't necessarily agree with what's written in the APA Style Manual or on the APA Style blog. When in doubt, always follow what the APA Style Manual says or what the APA Style blog says. So for additional online resources, it's important to note that the APA Style blog or the APA Twitter feed is a really good place to get up-to-date feedback or questions answered about how to cite new media. So for example, Snapchat is a form of media that has come out since 2009. There's no information in the 6th edition of the APA Style Manual about how to cite a Snapchat, but if you wanted to cite somebody's ideas which appeared in a Snapchat in an ethnographic study that you were running and you were trying to cite that in APA, you could always look on the APA Style blog, see if somebody else has had that question, if it's already been answered. If not, you can always contact APA through Twitter, and they're actually pretty fast about getting back to you and giving you information about how to deal with those fringe or unique cases using APA Style. So why should you use APA Style? Why go through all of this work to figure out how to cite in this very particular way and write in this very particular way? Well, the first thing APA Style provides is a consistent format for you to both read and publish work within your discipline and across other disciplines. So it gives us this really familiar way to communicate so that people reading your work and people writing work know how to talk about their references and communicate their ideas in a way that other people in the field are going to be used to and understand. APA Style is also helpful because it can protect you against plagiarism. So you don't want to ever claim somebody else's ideas as your own, and by properly citing where your ideas came from and giving your reader a sense of how to find those sources, you're making sure that you're not accidentally claiming somebody else's ideas as your own. It also helps readers cross-reference your sources. So if you are writing about somebody else's ideas in order to support an argument you are trying to make, by citing those other sources appropriately, you allow your readers to more effectively find those sources and cross-reference your work. And by being able to cross-reference your work, your evidence feels more substantial and therefore your argument is stronger. So in that sense, it's giving you credibility as an academic writer. Also, by writing in the style format that people in your field are used to, you're improving your credibility as somebody who writes within academia. So as just mentioned, one of the benefits of using APA is it can protect you against plagiarism. And plagiarism is basically when you take the ideas, research, theories of words of another person and try to pass them off as your own. It's a very serious academic offense, even when it's unintentional. So it's super important that anytime you're using an idea that's not entirely your own, you're giving credit to where that idea actually came from. So when in doubt, give credit where credit is due. So what do professors mean when they say write in APA style? Do they mean the editorial style, which are the rules around punctuation, abbreviation, how to make tables, selecting headings, etc.? Or do they mean APA style as in the way you cite your references in text, or the way that you write the reference list at the end of your paper? The important thing to note is that when people say they want you to write in APA style, there is a singular way to do that, but the extent to which the person asking you to write in APA style wants you to actually apply APA to your writing might differ. So for example, one professor might say, I want you to write a paper for me and I want it to be in APA style. And what they might mean by that is just that your in-text citations have to be APA formatted and your reference list has to be APA formatted. However, another teacher might say, I want you to write in APA style, and they might mean your tables have to be APA formatted, and you need to have an APA formatted cover letter, and you need to have an APA formatted running head. So when in doubt, it's always important to ask a teacher when they say write in APA style, what exactly they mean by that, and to what extent they want APA applied to your writing. So, now that we've talked a little bit about the importance of APA and how it can be used, the major questions that usually come up tend to be around citing in APA. So the first question that comes up most often is, when should I cite? And as we mentioned earlier, the general rule of thumb is, when in doubt, always cite your sources. So anytime you're using a verbatim quotation or two or more consecutive words, anytime you're referencing an idea somebody had, even if you're just paraphrasing or summarizing facts or ideas that you got from somewhere other than your own head, you should always cite. You don't have to cite information that's common knowledge, but be careful. And the reason we tell you to be careful is because what counts as common knowledge might differ from field to field, from publication to publication, or even from situation to situation. So, as we said before, when in doubt, cite. If you have questions about whether or not something is common knowledge, go to a professor acting as your advisor or a professor for whom you're writing, and you can always check with them whether or not it's considered common knowledge. A common example of this might be something like Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, right? So within my field, the idea of zone of proximal development and the fact that it was Vygotsky's idea is common knowledge. And so it's not uncommon for me to read journal papers where people will talk about the zone of proximal development and not necessarily cite Vygotsky. That being said, if I were publishing in another field, that idea might not be considered common knowledge, and then it would be important for me to cite where that idea came from. So again, when in doubt, always cite, and cite sources for ideas or information that you think could be regarded as common knowledge, but you think your reader might be unfamiliar with. So as I just mentioned, anytime you're incorporating information from another work or another person into your writing, it's important that you cite and that you cite in APA formatting. So there are three major types of ways in which you incorporate information into your writing. The first is a quotation, and that's pretty much any time you're identically taking words from some original source and putting them into your own writing. Whenever you do a quotation, make sure that you're using quotation marks before and after the quote. And after the quote, there will always be an in-text citation attributing it to the original source. So again, if you're taking word for word what somebody else said and putting it into your writing, this is considered a quotation. And we differentiate this from paraphrasing, which is when you put a passage from the original source material into your own words. So like a quotation, during paraphrasing, you need to put an in-text citation attributing the information back to the original source. But paraphrasing might mean the section is slightly shorter than the original passage because it's condensed as opposed to taking an idea word for word. And these two are separated from summarizing, which is when the main ideas are put into your own words. So this might mean that the main points of information you're using are reworked, but the rest of what you wanted to say is left out, right? So you're taking the main points and leaving out details that don't potentially support your argument. As with paraphrasing and quoting, summarizing needs to be cited at the end. So long story short, whether you're taking words word for word from a source, you're paraphrasing those words, or you're summarizing those ideas, you always, always, always have to cite when taking ideas from somebody else and incorporating them into your writing. So those are the three most common ways that people incorporate information from others into their own work. And one of the most commonly used ways that people incorporate information from outside sources into their own work is paraphrasing. Note that paraphrasing can be really hard because you need to make sure that you don't copy the original author's style or wording. So even if you have a citation, if you copy what the original author said or their exact wording, it can be considered plagiarism. So paraphrases need to sound like you. They need to use vocabulary and sentence structure that a reader would recognize as your work, not the original author's work. So, like I said, this can be really hard, and to practice doing it, we're going to give you a few tips. So the first one is read the original passage that you want to paraphrase and write down some main points, right? You don't want to write down something in great detail because you might end up borrowing the original author's wording. So just think about, at a high level, what is the original author trying to say? Then, using just those main points and without looking at the original, try to write your paraphrase of what the author said. Once you've finished writing your paraphrase, you want to compare what you wrote to what the original author wrote. Did you simply change a few words and find synonyms for them? If so, try again, right? You don't want to just cross out a few words from the original and put in synonyms for those words and say that's your own work. Have you included exact sentence sequences or words from the original? So if you have more than 2 consecutive words from the original in your own writing, you need to put quotation marks around those phrases or rewrite the entire paraphrase until it's in your own words. Finally, ask yourself if you've retained the meaning of the original. So changing the author's meaning is not plagiarism, but academic honesty requires you to represent another person's work accurately in your own writing. So again, paraphrasing is really hard. You can't say exactly what the original author said. You have to say it in your own words. You have to say it using your own style. You can't change the meaning of what the original author said. So to start, let's practice, right? Practice doesn't make perfect, but practice makes better. And better can prevent you from accidentally plagiarizing one of your source's works. So to practice paraphrasing, take a minute, read this passage, and follow the steps on the previous slide to try to paraphrase it, right? So you want to do your best to make sure that you're capturing the ideas, keeping that sentiment the same, but writing it in your own words. So take a minute, pause the video, read this, try to paraphrase it, and then press play and see how we might paraphrase this in APA. So here's our paraphrase of the quotation, and what you'll see is it's written in a different style. It sounds like it was written by a different author. There aren't multiple words taken from the original and just put in a different order or using synonyms from words from the original, but the sentiment from the original is still there. And so even though we've paraphrased effectively, it's also important to note that we've properly cited our paraphrase using APA citation. Here's another example of a quotation that you could paraphrase. So again, take a minute, read this, and try to paraphrase it in your own words. So here's another way that you could paraphrase. Note that in contrast to the previous example, this paraphrase is significantly shorter than the original. Again, the sentiment is still there. So whereas in the original, they go into a lot of detail about what suffering from abuse looks like, in the paraphrase, we just call it suffering from abuse and neglect. In the original, even though they might say something very specific like, these people have no one to care for them and no one knows them intimately, in the paraphrase, we've taken that idea and thought of it instead as experiencing isolation. So again, the ideas from the original author are retained, but our writing reflects us thinking about those ideas, talking about them more concisely, and communicating them using our own style and our own voice. Again, super important to note that even though we've paraphrased correctly, it's important that we're also still citing where this idea came from. Here's one last example in order for you to practice paraphrasing. Again, take a minute to pause the video, read this original passage, and see how you might paraphrase it in your own words. So here's a way you might paraphrase this using APA. Notice the citation style that we've used here. So in the previous example, we simply did the paraphrase, and then in the citation at the end, we had the author's name, a comma, and then the year. In the example before that, we had the paraphrase, and then at the end, we had the author's name, a comma, a year, and then the page where the idea came from. Here, we directly talk about the author, and when we first mention the author, we put the year in which the publication that we are citing was published. And then at the end of the paraphrase, we put the page where the idea came from. So it's important to note that all three of these are correct, and the citation style you use depends in part on how you want to talk about the author and how you want to reference them. Generally, when paraphrasing and quoting, you want to always use a page number if possible. If you're citing an online source that doesn't have a page number but has paragraphs, you would cite the paragraph number. Anytime you cite somebody using APA, you always need to use that author's name and cite the year that the publication was published. However, whether you mention the author in your actual text and then put the year in quotation marks, or if you put the author at the end of the citation in the year both in quotation marks, doesn't matter. The only thing that matters in that case is whether or not you actually want to talk about or reference the author in your writing, or if you just want to reference the author in the end and the citation. So now that we've talked about the proper ways to summarize and paraphrase information, let's talk a little bit what it looks like when students plagiarize. So here, again, we have an original source where it talks about students frequently overuse direct quotation and taking notes. As a result, they overuse quotations in the final research paper. Probably only about 10% of your final manuscript should appear as directly quoted matter. Therefore, you should strive to limit the amount of exact transcribing of source materials while taking notes. So that's the original source. And then here we have a way in which a student actually quoted that source. So notice that they didn't properly quote the source, right? We don't see any quotation marks here. So since there are no quotation marks, we would assume that what the student is trying to do is either summarize or paraphrase. But this is problematic, right? Because what we see is that in attempting to paraphrase or summarize, the student has actually taken a lot of sentence structure and a lot of direct phrases from the original author and used them without quoting them, right? So the original author says, students frequently overuse direct quotation. This says, students often use too many direct quotations, right? So not exactly the same, but there are more than 2 words in a row that are the same, and the style and essence of what the original source has said is maintained in the student's quote-unquote paraphrase, right? So the student doesn't change up sentence structure, they don't take up style, they're just taking some words like frequently overused and rephrasing them as often used too many. Then we see parts of the paper where there is actual direct copying word for word. So probably only about 10% of your final manuscript versus probably only about 10% of the final copy. That's almost word for word the exact same phrase. So this student either needs to make a commitment to actually direct quoting the original author and just using this as a quotation, or the student needs to go back and rewrite this as a paraphrase or summary by changing the style, the sentence structure, and the wording so that the original author's ideas are maintained, but it doesn't sound almost exactly like the original author. Here's another example where we see a lot of the similar stuff. So here we have an original source passage. On the right, you have a way in which a student tried to paraphrase that original source passage. And what you see is the parts that are underlined and in green are directly taken from the original source with little to no changes at all. Again, the student could choose to put these green parts in quotations and properly quote the original source, or they could go back to try to rewrite a paraphrase of the original source. So here is one final example of a student trying to paraphrase or summarize an original author, but not doing it effectively and therefore plagiarizing, right? So here the student has written something that's much shorter than what the original source has said, but maintains the original source's ideas. The problem is, again, if we look at the parts which are underlined and in green, we see that they are almost directly word for word taken from the original source. So again, the student needs to decide. Either they can take what the original source said and directly quote them and use quotation marks, or they can go back and try to paraphrase more specifically. Notice that if the student were to actually quote the original author, they would need to use all of the original author's words, right? So they can't say friendly Sioux were suddenly plunged into new conditions and put that into quotation marks because the original author said friendly Indians were suddenly plunged now with their condition only 2 years previous, right? So they would have to use the exact wording of the original source, or they would need to change their own wording more significantly and the sentence structure of their own writing more significantly if they wanted to paraphrase. So it's hard, like we said before, to paraphrase or summarize effectively because it needs to sound significantly different. Or if you quote, it needs to sound exactly the same. Word for word, it has to be exactly what the author said. So doing this kind of writing that we see on the right here with what this student wrote, they're taking an in-between path where it kind of sounds like the student's own writing. It's kind of different from the original, but it's not different enough. And this kind of uncanny valley of writing is what's considered plagiarism in APA. So you're going to want to have to stay away from that. So now that we've talked about how to incorporate information into our work effectively using APA citations, let's talk about the other ways in which APA informs us of how to write our paper. So as I mentioned previously, APA is a style guide not just for citations and reference lists, but for your entire paper as a whole. And it has really specific rules about what your paper should look like, right? So first of all, your paper should have 1-inch margins on every side. You're going to want to use 12-point Times New Roman font. And if you want to emphasize a point, you would use bold or italics, right? So if you want to highlight a word in some way, instead of underlining that word or using color, you're going to bold that word or put that word in italics in order to put emphasis. There are 2 different types of spacing that you need to use in APA. So the first is you need to double space your text between lines, vertical spacing. So what this means is for every line of text that you write, there should be a blank space above and below it. And when we show you a sample APA formatted paper on the next page, you'll see what that looks like. In addition to the spacing between lines, you need 2 spacebar spaces after every punctuation mark. So when you're finishing a sentence with a period or an exclamation point or a question mark, you want 2 spaces before you start the next sentence. In terms of your language, you don't want contractions. So you don't want to use the word don't or won't or didn't. Instead, you would write those words out. So it would say do not, would not. And you need to have an abstract at the beginning of your paper. So the title for your abstract is centered but not bolded. You don't indent the first line of your abstract, and your abstract should not exceed 120 to 150 words. Now, this being said, I've had many students come up to me and say, oh, well, I was asked to write a paper for my class, but my abstract is allowed to be more than 150 words. Or I had to write an abstract for a conference, but I was allowed to write 180 or 200 words for that, even though the conference says that I need to write my paper in APA format. To that, I would say, again, when people say format your writing in APA format, the extent to which they want APA applied to your writing might actually differ, right? So if it were strictly APA formatted, your abstract would not exceed 150 words. And so if a conference or professor is saying you can use more words, that's fine, and you should listen to those specific guidelines coming from that source for whom you are writing. However, note that in that case, they're breaking APA or they're not applying APA in that way. So if they wanted it to be APA formatted, they would ask for 150 words. If they're asking for more or less than that, that's fine. Just know that in that specific instance, APA is not actually applying. In terms of alignment, this means where the text is in relation to the margin. You want all of your text to be aligned to the left, meaning that all of the text on the left side of your page is in a straight line. If I were to put a ruler there, all the sentences would start in the same place. And when I indent at the beginning of every paragraph, that indent is 1/2 inch in. No right justify means that on the right side of the page, as lines are ending, they're not aligned, right? So sentences might begin or end in different places on the right, even though on the left, they're all straight. So let's see what this is like. So this is an example of an APA formatted page. So let's look at the spacing we were talking about before, right? So if you look at the space between lines, there is black text, and then between each of those lines of black text, there's a blank white space. That's what we mean by vertical double spacing. If you look at the left side of the paper, especially in the abstract, you'll see that all the sentences start all the way over to the left. So that's what we mean by left alignment. But if you look at the right side of the paper, you'll see that the text kind of goes in and out because the lines are ending at different places. That's what we mean by no right justify. You'll notice that the abstract, the title is not bolded, so that's because of APA formatting. And if you look at the first page, which is the title page, you'll see that the beginning of each paragraph is indented a little bit. That's the 1/2 inch indent we were talking about for each paragraph. So again, note that every paragraph has a 1/2 inch indent except for in the abstract where there is no indent. A few more other things to note. On the first page of your paper in APA formatting, you're going to have the words running head. The word running is capitalized, the word head is not capitalized, and then you have a colon. After that, you're going to have the title of your paper. So for many people, this title will not necessarily be the title of their exact paper. In this case, it is very similar, but not exactly the same. So the title of the paper is Effects of Age on Detection of Emotional Information, and the running head is Effective Age on Detection of Emotion. So your running head is usually a shortened version of your actual title that's been shortened to 50 characters or less. But again, it should maintain the meaning of your title. The title that runs on every line of your page is going to be in all caps. And also note that the words running ahead are going to appear on the first page of your manuscript, but after that, the title is running at the top of your page in all caps on every page, but the words running head don't appear again. They only appear on the first page. You're also going to have page numbers on the upper right-hand corner of each of your pages, and you are going to make sure that none of your headings in the author's note, title of the paper, or abstract are bolded. However, when you do have headings to separate sections, those are bolded depending on the level of the heading. So what this means is, let's say after your abstract, your paper has multiple sections. There's a literature review section, and then you have a method section, and then you have a results section, and then you have a conclusion. Each of those sections would be delineated by putting in a heading, and those biggest sections are going to be level heading 1. So when you write methods, that word methods that starts the beginning of your methods section is going to be centered, it's going to be bold, and it's going to be upper and lowercase, meaning the M in methods is going to be capitalized, but the rest of the letters in the word method are not going to be capitalized, right? Sometimes we refer to this as title case. If within any of those sections you have subsections, those would then get a level 2 heading, right? So a level 2 heading, instead of being centered, would be flush left. So let's say within your methods section, you have a section for participants, a section for your procedure, and a section for your methods, right? Each of those subsections that come under the level 1 heading of method would then have their own level headings, and those level headings would be considered level 2. So they would be to the left, they would be bold, and again, they would be in this title case, right? An easy way to think about title case is think about the way that upper and lower case are used in the title of a book, right? Major words are always capitalized, minor words like prepositions are never capitalized. That's the same kind of capitalization you want to use with level headings in APA. And then we continue to have rules for level headings going all the way down to level heading 5. So let's say that within your measures section, which is under the methods section, right? So we're now 3 levels in, you have different measures, and each of those measures have headings. You would then, to delineate each of those sections, indent your titles, bold them, and you would not use title case anymore, right? So your entire thing would be written in a lowercase heading, and you'd have a period at the end. If you have another level of headings under that, you would then italicize, and if you have another level of headings under that, you would then no longer bold. So it's unlikely that you're ever going to have subsections of your paper that go all the way down that you would have more than 5 headings. I would actually strongly recommend that you don't. But within each of those levels up to 5, APA has really strict rules on how they want those level headings formatted. The reason it says page 62 at the top is because within the 6th edition APA style manual, page 62 is where these rules appear, and you can always go to the manual to read more about these level heading rules if you have additional questions. So now that we've talked about the general formatting of the paper according to APA, let's get into how do we actually cite authors in text. And this is probably going to be the most common way you're going to be using APA throughout your writing. So the basic format for citations in text is you want to give the author's surname, so that's the author's last name, the year of publication, and sometimes a page number. So if you're directly quoting or paraphrasing an author, you're going to want to use a page number. If you're summarizing what an author has said, you don't need to give a page number. When in doubt, always give more information rather than less information, or you can always talk to a writing advisor or potentially your own instructor if you have questions. Note that once you referenced an author once, if you continue to talk about that same study within the same paragraph, you don't need to repeat the year, right? So let's say I'm talking about Chan, and Chan wrote an article published in 1996, and I'm talking about Chan's study. If in the next sentence I then continue to talk about Chan, I don't need to recite her, right? I don't need to put the year or the page number again. I can just continue to talk about Chan. Now, if I then mention another paper, let's say by Dewey, I would then need to cite Dewey. And then if I go back to talking about Chan, I need to recite Chan. So basically, every time you change the person you're talking about, you need to recite that person. But if you're talking about the same reference over and over again, and you don't talk about any other references, you're just talking extensively about one reference, you don't need to keep citing that reference until you change to talking about a different reference or until you change paragraphs. So let's say I'm talking about Chan 1996 for 2 paragraphs. The first time I mention Chan 1996, I need to cite her by putting the year in parentheses, and then I can continue to talk to her about her throughout that paragraph without citing her again. Then, when I go to the next paragraph, if I'm still talking about Chan 1996, I need to recite that paper because I have moved paragraphs, and so I need to reestablish which reference I'm talking about. So what do I do when I want to cite multiple authors? Well, when I want to cite multiple authors, I would put either both their names and then the year immediately after, or I would say what they said by summarizing or paraphrasing them. And then at the end of that sentence, put a parentheses, put both of the authors' last names with an ampersand, that's the and sign, between their last names, a comma, and then the year that they were published. If you use 3, 4, or 5 authors, you would cite all the authors the first time their reference occurs in the text. However, if later in the text you end up having to cite them again, you would only need to put the surname of the first author and then put et al. With a period. So for example, let's say I have 4 or 5 authors, including Dunkel and a bunch of other last names, and they published something in 1993. The first time in my manuscript I cite Dunkel and his colleagues, I need to put all of their last names and then put a comma in 1993 if I'm doing this end parenthetical citation as we see in the second example here. Or if I'm writing all their names in the text, I would say all their last names and then put a parentheses and put 1993 for the year it was published. However, if later I go back and I end up talking about Dunkel again, I would just say, as discussed in the previous chapter, Dunkel et al., 1993, do not agree with this perspective. And so this just means et al. Is Latin for and others, and it basically means that I'm referencing Dunkel and his colleagues. The other way you could do it is the same as before, which is, as discussed in the previous chapter, there's an alternative respective, and then I say Dunkel et al., comma, 1993. So again, it doesn't matter if you mention the author in the text and then put the year in parentheses after, or if you just do the whole citation in the parentheses at the end by putting the author's name and then a comma and then the year. But if you have more than 2 authors, after you cite them the first time, you don't need to list all the authors' names in further citations. So contrast this where you have 6 or more authors, right? So if you have 6 or more authors who are on a paper together and you're going to reference that paper, then the first time you cite that paper in your text, you can just say the last name of the first author, et al., and then the year, right? So here we have a paper by Fredericks and a bunch of other people that was published in 2008. So the first time I cite this paper in my own writing, I would just put Fredericks et al., comma, 2008. In the actual reference list, however, I would put the first 6 authors in full. Then I would put this thing we call ellipses, which is 3 periods, and then put the last author's name and put 2008. And so what this means were between Trollope and Kong, there were other authors listed on this paper, but we're not going to list all of them, right? We're just going to list the first 6, put an ellipses to take out anyone else who was mentioned, put the last author, and then put the year. This is for the reference list. In the actual in-text citation, we don't list all these authors, we just list the first author and put et al. To mean there are many others, but I'm not going to list all of them. So that's how to cite multiple people. How do I cite the same person who may have written multiple papers, right? So if that one author published 2 or more works, and I want to reference multiple works together by that one author, I would just put the author's name, and then I would put a comma, and I would put comma between all the different years of all the publications they wrote I want to reference, and I would put them in chronological order, right? So earlier papers come first, later published papers come later. If that author wrote multiple papers in the same year, then I would distinguish between those papers by putting an A, B, or C. So let's say that this author wrote 3 papers in 1984 and 2 papers in 1985, and I'm referencing all those papers in my work. In this case, I just want to reference the first paper they wrote in 1984 and the second paper they wrote in 1985. So in my reference list, I would reference all the papers they wrote in 1984 that I referenced throughout my work, and all the papers they wrote in 1985 that I referenced throughout my work. And then I would distinguish between those by putting letters, right? So the first paper that person wrote in 1984 is 1984A. Second paper they wrote in 1984 is 1984B. And then when I'm citing those various papers throughout my own work, instead of just putting 1984, I put 1984 and then the letter of the paper they wrote that year that I'm specifically referring to. If I have two or more works by different authors, then what I do is I list their names in alphabetical order by the first author's surname and separate the citations by semicolons, right? So let's say that I'm trying to make a claim in my paper that several studies come to the same conclusion. And those studies are 2 papers by Balda, a paper by Camille, and a paper by Pepperberg and Funk, right? Because I have multiple papers by Balda, I do the same thing we talked about in the slide before. I put Balda's name, a comma, and then commas between each of the years that this author wrote papers. Then I put a semicolon to say, I'm now going to talk to you about a different author. And I put the next author who said something that I wanted to cite, and that's Camille. And they wrote a paper in 1978 that I'm citing, and so I would put that there. And then I put a semicolon, and I put the next paper that I'm going to cite, which is by Pepperberg and Funk. And there were multiple authors on those papers, so I list both the author's name and then put a comma and then put the year that those people were there. So in general, you're putting a semicolon between each publication that you are citing if you're citing multiple publications at the same time, except for if multiple publications have the same author or set of authors, in which case you would just put commas between the years in which those different papers by the same author were published. So what do we do if there is no author? We can see in APA citation that it's very heavily dependent on citing the author of a work. But sometimes you might be citing something that was a report that was published by an institution and not a particular individual or set of named individuals. In this case, you would take the institution, agency, corporation, or other group and treat them as if they were the author, right? After using the full name of that institution, and you can put an abbreviation for that institution in brackets, you can then just use that abbreviation in later citations, right? So let's say the National Institute of Mental Health wrote a report in 2001, and I'm citing that report. Instead of the author's name, because there is no author, I would just put National Institute of Mental Health. In brackets, I would put the abbreviation I'm then going to use, which is NIMH. I'd put a comma and then the year of the report. And then for the rest of my paper, if I cite that same report again, I would just say NIMH, 2001 to reference that report. So as mentioned previously, anytime you directly quote an author, you need to put a citation. But what that citation looks like depends on how you want to talk about the author and the year in which your reference for them happened. So for example, let's look at the first example here. So here I want to talk about the author in my writing where I introduce the quote, but I don't want to necessarily name the year of the reference which I'm referring to for them. So what I would do is when I first mention the author, I put the year in which their publication that I'm referencing was published in parentheses, and then I put the page number on which the quote I'm using appears at the end of the quotation. If I didn't want to talk about the author in my introductory language, then what I would do is I would just introduce the quote, give the quote, and at the end, in parentheses, I would put the author, comma, the year, comma, the page. If I'm willing to talk about both the author and the year of their publication in my introductory language, then I don't need to use parentheses. I can just say this author in 2009 noted that a traumatic response frequently entails X. Give the quotation, and then at the end of the quotation, put the page number where that quotation appears. Finally, if I'm referencing something that doesn't have pages, so let's say the National Institute of Mental Health in 2009 wrote a report. This report appears online. I'm citing it, but I can't tell you the page that the quote I'm pulling comes from because there are no pages. It's a website. What I would do is I would count what paragraph it's in. So in this case, it's in paragraph 2, and instead of p.2 at the end, I put para.2, meaning this quote comes from the second paragraph. So these rules that we just talked about are ways to cite quotations and use quotations that are fewer than 40 words. So if I'm using direct quote from an author and the direct quote I'm using is less than 40 words, I would just introduce it in my actual text where I'm making my argument, and I would put quotation marks around the direct quotation that I'm using, and I would cite it using the rules we just talked about. However, if the quotation I'm using is more than 40 words, then we would use what I call a block quote. So a block quote is, instead of integrated into the rest of your text, a quote that stands alone. If you were going to use a block quote, the quote would start on a new line, so it would look like its own paragraph. The whole block quote would be indented half an inch from the line above it, so it would look like it's, like I said, own paragraph, but where the whole paragraph is left aligned and indented half an inch. In general, I would recommend staying away from block quotes unless you really do need to show a significant amount of text and make sure that that text is read in full in order to then be evaluated. So for example, I might use a block quote if I want to show the reader an entire paragraph from an author, and then I want to take some time step by step dissecting the language in that paragraph. So we don't see block quotes too often, and even with regular quotations that are less than 40 words, I would recommend using them sparingly. So when you use quotations, it's important not to modify them. So for example, you want to make sure your quotation is the exact same wording, spelling, and punctuation as the original author intended. This means that if the author made a mistake, like they spelled a word wrong or they used a wrong form of punctuation given what they were saying grammatically, you would reproduce that mistake. What you would then do is insert a bracket with the word sick immediately after the error. And this indicates to the reader that the error was an error that the original author who you are citing made, not an error you made in transcribing the quotation. That being said, there are some changes that you can make. So for example, if you are quoting something that starts with a capital letter, but you're introducing that quote so it ends up appearing in the middle of a sentence you're writing, you can change the first letter from an uppercase to a lowercase letter. The vice versa is also true. If you're using a direct quote from an author and it is something that starts in the middle of a sentence, but you want to use a piece of it that can stand alone in its own sentence, you can make the first letter of that quote uppercase. Similarly, if you have a quote and at the end of the quote you have a punctuation mark that you want to change, you're able to change that. You can also make some changes to the quotation if you add explanation. So for example, let's say that I have a quote and I'm using a direct quote, but I'm going to take out some information from that quote. I can put in an ellipses. Another thing I can do is I can add material if I add that material using brackets, right? So let's say I'm using a direct quote that says, improvement was seen among all individuals in the samples. But I, as the writer, want to specify that all refers to both boys and girls. I can put in a bracket and say boys and girls, and then end the bracket, and it's signaling to the reader that I added the words boys and girls to add clarification. Those are not words that come from the original author. The final modification I can make to a quotation is emphasis by adding my own italics. If I do this, I then need to have a bracket that has the words italics added in it so that the person knows that these italics didn't appear in the original version by the original author. That was added for my own emphasis. So for example, if I wanted to say only participants in the negative condition showed improvement and I wanted to put emphasis on condition, I could italicize the word condition and then put the bracket and put the words italics added to indicate that was something I added. Note that with all of these modifications, you really should add explanation. So you shouldn't just go willy-nilly through quotations and change what an original author wrote just so that it sounds better. There should be intention behind these things, and as you discuss the quote later on in your own writing, you should be specific as to why you made these changes. Final thing that we're going to talk about today with APA is the reference list. And the reference list is a list of all the citations you used, basically all the different things that you referenced throughout your paper. It appears at the end of your paper, and what it really does is acts as a way for readers to go back to the original sources. So your in-text citations are telling us who from your reference list you're referencing at any given time as we read your paper. Your reference list tells us what those publications actually were and where we can find them. Every source that's cited in your text needs to be in the reference list. The only exception is personal communication. So what does the reference list look like? Basically, it's going to be a new page at the end of your paper, so it shouldn't start at the end of your conclusion. It really needs to start on its own page. You're going to want to type the word references in upper and lowercase letters centered at the top of the page. It's generally double spaced, except for student papers sometimes aren't. So again, you're going to want to clarify with your professor what they prefer. Entries are going to have a 1/2 inch hanging indent. So we'll see what this looks like on the next slide, but basically it's the reverse of what you would see with a typical paragraph. So with a typical paragraph, the first line is indented, and then everything else is all the way justified left, touching the margin. In the reference list, the first line is all the way left, touching the margin, and then everything after the first line is indented 1/2 inch. For every citation in your reference list, you're going to want a lot of the same information as you would see in the in-text citation. So you need the author's surname, you need the year of publication, but you're also going to put the first and middle initials of all your authors and the publishing data. And again, this is what's going to help readers actually find the exact publications that you're citing throughout your work. So let's look at what a few of these look like. The first one is a basic format for books. Notice again we have this hanging indent we were talking about before. So the first line that has the authors is all the way to the left, and then every line after that is indented 1/2 inch. You're going to have your author's names. So for each author as published in order, you're going to have the last name of the first author and then a comma, and then their first and middle initials, and then a comma, and then the next author. If you have just 2 authors, you're going to put an ampersand between the 2 authors' names. After all the authors' names are listed, you're going to put the year of the publication in parentheses, the title of the publication in italics with a period after that, and then you're going to put the publishing data. So in this case, it is the place in which the book was published, a colon, and then the name of the publication company in a period. If you have an edited book without an author, you do basically the exact same thing. The only difference is you're going to put the editor's names instead of the author's names, and you're going to put the letters EDS period in parentheses right after the editor's names to indicate that they're editors and not authors. Another thing to note is if you're referencing an entire book, you would do it the way we said in the previous slide, where you have the authors of the book, the name of the book, and the publication data of the book. However, if you're only referencing an article or a chapter in the edited book, then you're first going to put the information for the article or chapter that you're referencing. So in this case, we start out with the authors of the, let's say in this case it's a chapter. We're going to start out with the authors of the specific chapter within the book that we're referencing. Then we have the title of the chapter. Notice that it's not title case, right? The first letter of the first word of the chapter is capitalized, and the first letter after the colon, which is the subtitle, is capitalized, but everything else is in lowercase. After we have the name of the chapter, you would put in, and then you would put the name of the editors of the book in which that chapter appears. After that, you would put the name of the book, again, that the chapter appears, and the page numbers of the chapters, and then you would put the publishing information. More often than not, most of your publications in academia are probably going to come from articles in a journal. So usually these are either paginated by volume or paginated by issue. So in your typical journal article, it's going to look very similar to a book reference where you're going to start with the surname and initials of the author, the year in parentheses, the name of the article, and then a period and the name of the journal in which that article appears. Notice that the name of the journal is capitalized in title case. So whereas the name of the article is not capitalized in title case, right? Like the words preparing, psychology, journal, and articles are all lowercase. Every major word in the name of the journal itself is capitalized, right? So comparative, physiological psychology, those are all capitalized. So the name of the journal is italicized, and after that, you're going to put the volume in which that article appears, right? So you keep in mind that journals are published often. It's not like a single book that might be published and have several chapters and then just appear that once. A journal is usually published every quarter or potentially even more frequently, and so you want to give us an indication of which volume of the journal this particular article appears. Then you would give us the page numbers on which that article appears, right? So keep in mind these are the page numbers that the entire article takes up, not the page numbers you're citing. So let's say in this particular article, I'm just using one quote from one page of the article. In my reference list, I'm putting down the page numbers of the entire article, not just the pages that I used. If the journal that you're pulling your article from also has issues, so issues appear within volumes, then you're going to do it the same way as you did before. It's just that after you put the volume number in parentheses, you're going to put the issue number. So for this second example here, we have the author, the year, the name of the article, which is The Eclipse of Listening, a period, the name of the journal it appears in, which is The New Criterion, a comma, the volume of that journal that this article is appearing in, which is 15. Notice that the volume number is always italicized, and then you're going to start parentheses and put the issue number, which in this case is 30. That is not italicized. And then you'll put a comma, and again, you'll put the pages on which the article appears. And again, these are all the pages in which the article appears, or all the pages in which the article spans. If you're using electronic sources, we do a lot of the same things, except for the fact that you're not necessarily going to have exact page numbers. So for example, if you have an online article, you're still going to put the author name, the year, the name of the article, the name of the journal in which that article appears, but you might just put, in this case, the volume number. There are no precise pages. In this case, you're going to put the words retrieved from and then the actual website from which this article was retrieved so that we would be able to find it. Again, the point of APA citations is so that somebody who's looking at your paper can find these articles, and so you want to make sure that they know which website you received this from, since there aren't physical journal publications they could look up. Another thing you can put is the actual DOI, which we will talk about on the next page. So the DOI is the Digital Object Identifier. You can almost think of this as a modern digital Dewey Decimal number, and basically it's a unique alphanumeric string assigned by a registration agency, the International DOI Foundation, to identify content and provide a persistent link to its location on the internet. So the idea is when we put retrieved from, we're telling you the exact URL where that article existed. But it could be that that website goes down or that the journal moves to a different URL. In that case, the journal article still exists. It still has a digital identifier, but it might not be at that specific URL. In this case, the DOI number is meant to help us identify which specific article you were referring to without having to link it to a specific location on the internet. The publisher assigns a DOI when your article is published and it's made available electronically. Note that all DOI numbers begin with a 10 and contain a prefix and a suffix separated by a slash. So the prefix is a unique number of 4 or more digits assigned to organizations, right? So specific journals might have their own prefix number. The suffix is assigned by the publisher and was designed to be flexible with publisher identification standards, right? So one journal article might have its own way of putting a suffix on articles that it publishes, whereas a different publisher might have a different way of assigning those numbers. So that flexibility is allowed in the suffix so that different publishers can have ways of assigning those numbers while still maintaining an ability to find that article online and maintain some level of consistency between different publishers. So this was a brief overview of some of the main components of APA style and formatting. As I mentioned before, you can always reference the APA style manual or other online sources that we listed, including the APA style blogs, the APA Twitter feed, and the Purdue Online Writing Lab in order to get more information on using APA and applying it to your writing. That being said, you can always contact us at the Teachers College Writing Center. Feel free to email us at writingcenter@tc.edu or to call our office. And you can always go to our website to sign up with an appointment with a counselor to get more information on specific APA questions you might have. Note that APA can be really hard to master and it takes a lot of time, so don't be afraid to ask questions or to try things out. We're here to help you and support you as best you can along this writing journey. Thanks and have a great day.